The Pig Farm Killer, the Robert Pickton story. 27 kilometers east of Vancouver, British Columbia, lies the quiet suburban municipality of Port Coquitlam. To most residents, it represents the peaceful rural heritage of the Lower Mainland, where farming communities once thrived before urban development transformed the landscape. But on one particular property at 953 Dominion Avenue, behind the facade of a working pig farm, one of Canada's most horrific serial killing sprees would unfold. This is the story of Robert William Pickton, known to the world as the Pig Farm Killer, or simply the Butcher, a man who would confess to 49 murders and be convicted of 6, forever changing how Canada views the safety of its most vulnerable citizens. The 1990s in Vancouver's Lower Mainland were a time of unprecedented growth and prosperity. The region was experiencing an economic boom that attracted people from across Canada and around the world. But this prosperity was not equally shared. In Vancouver's downtown Eastside, a neighborhood just blocks from the gleaming office towers and tourist attractions, a different reality existed, one of poverty, addiction, and desperation. It was here, in the shadows of Canada's most expensive real estate market, that dozens of women began to disappear. Most were Indigenous women, many struggled with substance abuse, and some worked as sex workers to survive. Their disappearances went largely unnoticed by mainstream society, dismissed by some as people who had simply moved on or met unfortunate but predictable ends given their circumstances. What few realized was that a predator was systematically hunting in this community, exploiting the very vulnerabilities that society chose to ignore. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24, 1949, to Leonard Francis Pickton and Louise Helene Arnold, pig farmers in Port Coquitlam. The Pickton family property was a working farm in what was then a more rural area, where the raising of livestock was a common occupation. But life on the Pickton farm was far from idyllic. Robert grew up with his older sister Linda Louise Wright and younger brother David Francis Pickton. Early in their childhood, Linda was sent to live with relatives in Vancouver. Their parents believed the pig farm was no place to raise a young girl. This decision left Robert and David to be raised in an environment where the pigs often seemed to take priority over the children's basic needs. Louise Pickton was described as a demanding mother who prioritized the farm's livestock over her son's personal hygiene and well-being. The boys were often sent to school in unwashed, dirty clothes that reeked of manure, earning them the cruel nickname Stinky Piggy from their classmates. This early social isolation and humiliation would mark Robert's formative years, creating a young man who struggled to form normal social connections. Robert's academic struggles began early. He failed second grade and was placed in special education classes, further isolating him from his peers. His strongest emotional attachment was to his demanding mother, while his relationship with his father was distant and troubled by abuse. The farm environment, while providing the family's livelihood, created a harsh and unforgiving childhood for the Pickton boys. A particularly traumatic incident occurred when Robert was 12 years old. He had been raising a calf as a beloved pet, developing the kind of emotional attachment that the farm rarely allowed. After school one day, he discovered his pet was missing. When told to check the barn, he found the calf had been slaughtered, a brutal introduction to the reality that on a working farm, emotional attachments to animals were a luxury the family could not afford. This incident would later be viewed by investigators and psychologists as potentially significant in understanding Pickton's psychology. The sudden violent loss of something he cared about, combined with the message that sentiment had no place in his world, may have contributed to his later ability to dehumanize his victims. In 1963, Robert dropped out of school and began working as a meat cutter, a trade he would pursue for nearly 7 years. This apprenticeship in butchery provided him with skills that would later prove crucial to his crimes, the ability to efficiently dismember bodies and dispose of remains. Eventually, he left the meat-cutting trade to work full-time on the family pig farm. When Leonard and Louise Pickton died in 1978 and 1979 respectively, the three siblings inherited the farm. As the Vancouver area continued to develop, the value of their land increased dramatically. They began selling portions of the property to developers, eventually earning $5.16 million from these sales. This sudden wealth transformed the Pickton brothers from struggling farmers into wealthy landowners. Workers who knew the farm during this period described it as a creepy-looking place, patrolled by a massive 612-pound boar. They characterized Robert as a pretty quiet guy, hard to strike up a conversation with, whose occasional bizarre behavior drew attention despite no evidence of substance abuse. The farm was becoming something more than an agricultural operation. It was evolving into a place where normal social rules seemed not to apply. With their newfound wealth, the Pickton brothers began hosting elaborate parties at what they called Piggy's Palace, an ad hoc nightclub on the farm property. These events were far from typical rural gatherings. They attracted Vancouver's political and economic elite alongside members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The parties featured raves and wild celebrations that drew as many as 2,000 people to the remote farm location. In 1996, the brothers formalized these activities by registering a nonprofit charity called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society with the Canadian government. They claimed their purpose was to organize, coordinate, manage and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of service organizations, sports organizations, and other worthy groups. In reality, these events often featured Vancouver sex workers and took place in a converted slaughterhouse on the property. The parties continued despite growing legal pressure from Port Coquitlam officials who sued the brothers for violating zoning ordinances. The municipality argued that the property was zoned for agriculture, not entertainment, and that the brothers had altered a large farm building on the land for the purpose of holding dances, concerts, and other recreations. After a 1998 New Year's Eve party, authorities obtained an injunction banning future events and authorizing police to arrest anyone attending parties on the farm. The first major warning sign of Robert Pickton's violent tendencies came on March 23, 1997, when he was charged with the attempted murder of sex worker Wendy Lynn Eistetter. During an altercation at the farm, Pickton had stabbed Eistetter 4 times after handcuffing her. She managed to escape after disarming him and stabbing him with his own weapon, leaving both injured parties seeking medical treatment at separate hospitals. Despite the severity of the attack, Pickton was released on just $2,000 bond. More troubling still, the attempted murder charge was stayed on January 27, 1998, because prosecutors believed Eistetter's drug addiction issues made her too unstable to testify effectively. This decision would later be viewed as a tragic missed opportunity that might have prevented dozens of future murders. During this same period, troubling reports began reaching police about the Pickton farm. An employee found several purses belonging to missing women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside and reported his suspicions to authorities. Police conducted 3 searches of the farm but found no evidence. In June 1999, they received a tip that Pickton had a freezer full of human flesh in his farmhouse, a tip they chose to ignore. Throughout the 1990s, women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside had been disappearing at an alarming rate. The majority were Indigenous women. Many struggled with substance abuse disorders, and some worked as sex workers. Their disappearances followed a pattern that should have raised immediate red flags. They would simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only worried friends and family members who found their concerns dismissed by authorities. The media had begun speculating that a serial killer was operating in the area, but police seemed reluctant to acknowledge this possibility. The victims came from a marginalized community that had historically received little attention from law enforcement, and their disappearances were often attributed to the transient lifestyle many were forced to live rather than predatory violence. What the public didn't know was that many of these women had connections to the Pickton farm. Some had attended the notorious parties at Piggy's Palace. Others had been offered work or shelter by Pickton himself. The farm, with its remote location and reputation for hosting events where sex workers were welcome, had become a common destination for women from the downtown East Side. The breakthrough in the case came on February 6, 2002, when police executed a search warrant for illegal firearms at the Pickton property. This warrant was unrelated to the missing women investigation, but what officers discovered during the search changed everything. Both Robert and David Pickton were arrested, and police immediately obtained a second warrant to search the farm as part of the BC missing women investigation. Personal items belonging to missing women were found scattered across the property, which was immediately sealed off by a joint RCMP and Vancouver Police Department task force. The following day, Robert Pickton was charged with weapons offenses, but investigators suspected they had stumbled upon something far more sinister. Both brothers were initially released, but Robert was placed under intensive police surveillance. On February 22, 2002, Robert Pickton was arrested again, this time charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. This was only the beginning. Over the following months, charges would continue to accumulate as the investigation revealed the true scope of Pickton's crimes. The charges against Pickton mounted with devastating regularity. On April 2, 2002, 3 more charges were added for the murders of Jacqueline McDonnell, Diane Rock, and Heather Bottomley. A 6th charge for Andrea Joesbury followed on April 9th, and a 7th for Brenda Wolfe shortly after. By September 20th, 4 more charges had been laid for Georgina Poppin, Patricia Johnson, Helen Hallmark, and Jennifer Firminger. The pattern continued relentlessly. On October 3rd, another 4 charges were added for Heather Chinnock, Tanya Holick, Sherry Irving, and Inga Hall. The most devastating wave came on May 26, 2005, when 12 more charges were laid for Cara Ellis, Andrea Boerhaven, Deborah Lynn Jones, Marnie Frey, Tiffany Drew, Carrie Koski, Sarah DeVries, Cynthia Felix, Angela Jardine, Wendy Crawford, Diana Melnick, and a Jane Doe, bringing the total to 27 murder charges. Each new charge represented not just a legal proceeding, but a woman whose life had been cut short, a family searching for answers, and a community grappling with the reality that their worst fears were being confirmed. The scale of the charges was unprecedented in Canadian criminal history, and the investigation was becoming one of the most complex and expensive in the country's history. The forensic investigation of the Pickton farm became a massive undertaking that continued through November 2003. The cost of the investigation reached an estimated $70 million by the end of 2003, making it one of the most expensive criminal investigations in Canadian history. The property was fenced off and placed under lien by the Crown, where it remains to this day. Forensic anthropologists brought in heavy equipment, including 2 50-foot flat conveyor belts and soil sifters, to methodically search for traces of human remains. The investigation was complicated by the nature of the disposal methods. Bodies may have been left to decompose naturally, consumed by insects and pigs, or processed through the farm's meat-cutting facilities. The most disturbing revelation came on March 10, 2004, when the government announced that Pickton may have ground up human flesh and mixed it with pork that he sold to the public. The province's health authority issued a warning, raising the horrifying possibility that unknowing consumers may have purchased meat contaminated with human remains. Additional claims suggested that he fed bodies directly to his pigs, using the animals as living disposal units. While being held in jail in Surrey, British Columbia, Pickton shared a cell with what he believed was another detainee. In reality, his cellmate was an undercover RCMP officer, and Pickton's conversations with this officer would provide some of the most damning evidence against him. During these conversations, Pickton confessed to 49 murders, expressing regret that he hadn't reached his goal of 50 because he got sloppy and was caught. In 2003, during a preliminary hearing, police seized clothes and rubber boots that Pickton had been wearing during the 1997 assault on Wendy Lynn Eistetter. Laboratory testing in 2004 revealed that DNA from 2 of his alleged victims, Andrea Boerhaven and Cara Ellis, was found on these items, providing crucial physical evidence linking Pickton to the murders. Pickton's trial began on January 30, 2006 in New Westminster, British Columbia. He pleaded not guilty to 27 charges of first-degree murder in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The voir dire phase of the trial took most of the year as lawyers argued over what evidence would be admissible before the jury, with reporters banned from disclosing any details of these proceedings. On March 17, 2006, one count was rejected by Justice James Williams for lack of evidence. More significantly, on August 9th, Justice Williams made the controversial decision to sever the charges, splitting them into one group of 6 counts and another group of 20. The judge explained that trying all 26 charges at once would place an unreasonable burden on the jury, as the trial could have lasted up to 2 years and significantly increased the possibility of a mistrial. The decision to proceed with only 6 charges first was met with criticism from victims' families and advocates who worried that the remaining charges might never be heard. However, the practical realities of conducting such a complex trial made the severance necessary from a legal standpoint. The jury trial on the first 6 counts began on January 22, 2007. Pickton faced first-degree murder charges in the deaths of Marnie Frey, Serena Abotsway, Georgina Papin, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, and Mona Wilson. When the media ban was eventually lifted, the public learned the horrifying details of what investigators had discovered on the farm. The evidence presented painted a picture of systematic murder and disposal of human remains. Personal belongings of the victims were found scattered across the property, including identification cards, jewelry, and clothing. DNA evidence linked victims to various locations on the farm, while Pickton's own recorded statements to the undercover officer provided insight into his methods and motivations. The prosecution argued that Pickton had used his farm as a killing ground, exploiting the isolation of the property and his knowledge of meat processing to efficiently murder and dispose of his victims. The defense, while not disputing that murders had occurred, attempted to raise reasonable doubt about Pickton's sole responsibility for the crimes. On December 9, 2007, after deliberating the evidence, the jury reached a verdict that would disappoint many who had hoped for first-degree murder convictions. Pickton was found not guilty on the 6 counts of first-degree murder, but guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. While the legal distinction was significant, the practical impact on sentencing was minimal. On December 11, 2007, after hearing 18 victim impact statements from families of the deceased, Justice James Williams sentenced Pickton to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence for second-degree murder and equivalent to what he would have received for first-degree murder convictions. In delivering the sentence, Justice Williams stated, "Mr. Pickton's conduct was murderous and repeatedly so. I cannot know the details, but I know this. What happened to them was senseless and despicable." Behind the legal proceedings and media coverage were real women whose lives were cut short by Pickton's violence. Serena Abotsway was a 29-year-old woman who had struggled with addiction but was trying to rebuild her life. Mona Wilson, 26, was a mother who had become estranged from her family due to her drug use. Andrea Josbury was just 22 when she disappeared, leaving behind a young son. Marnie Frey was 25 and had been trying to overcome her addiction when she vanished. Georgina Papin, 34, was an Indigenous woman whose disappearance highlighted the particular vulnerability of Indigenous women in Vancouver's downtown Eastside. Brenda Wolfe was 32 and had been working as a sex worker to support her drug habit when she encountered Pickton. Each of these women had families who loved them, friends who missed them, and dreams that were cut short by violence. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but a systemic failure to protect society's most vulnerable members. The legal proceedings did not end with Pickton's conviction. On January 7, 2008, the Attorney General filed an appeal in the British Columbia Court of Appeal, challenging Pickton's acquittals on the first-degree murder charges. 2 days later, Pickton's lawyers filed their own appeal, seeking a new trial on the 6 counts of second-degree murder. The appeals process wound its way through the court system over the next 3 years. The British Columbia Court of Appeal issued its decisions on June 25, 2009, dismissing the defense appeal by a 2-1 majority, but allowing portions of the Crown appeal. Due to a dissent on a point of law, Pickton was entitled to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. On July 30, 2010, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered its final decision, dismissing Pickton's appeal and affirming his convictions. The court split 6-3 in its legal analysis, but was unanimous in rejecting Pickton's argument for a new trial. The long appeals process was finally over, and Pickton's convictions were confirmed at the highest level of the Canadian justice system. With Pickton's convictions confirmed, the question remained of what to do with the 20 remaining murder charges. In August 2010, British Columbia Crown spokesman Neil Mackenzie announced that prosecution of these charges would likely be discontinued, reasoning that any additional convictions could not result in any increase to the sentence that Mr. Pickton has already received. The decision to stay the remaining charges was met with mixed reactions from victims' families. Some were disappointed that Pickton would never be held legally accountable for these additional murders, while others were relieved that the gruesome details of more murders would not be aired in public court proceedings. The practical reality was that Pickton was already serving the maximum possible sentence under Canadian law. The Pickton case had exposed serious deficiencies in how police had handled the missing women investigation. In 2010, Deputy Chief Constable Doug Leipard of the Vancouver Police Department issued a public apology to the victims' families, stating, "I wish from the bottom of my heart that we would have caught him sooner. I wish that the several agencies involved, that we could have done better in so many ways." The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, chaired by Wally Oppel, was established to examine the role of police forces in the disappearances and murders. The commission's final report, released in December 2012, criticized police for their handling of the investigation and made numerous recommendations for preventing similar failures in the future. The inquiry revealed that police bias against sex workers, Indigenous women, and drug users had contributed to the delayed response to the disappearances. The case became a catalyst for broader discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, eventually leading to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The Pickton case captured public attention not only in Canada, but internationally, spawning numerous books, documentaries, and fictional works. The Canadian crime drama Da Vinci's Inquest featured a major plotline dealing with missing women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, making reference to the pig farm in relation to the case. In 2005, the American horror film Killer Pickton was released, loosely based on the murders. The 2009 Criminal Minds season finale, To Hell and Back, adapted key details of the case, featuring two brothers on a pig farm who abducted vulnerable women. A 2016 film called Unclaimed was also based on the case, using the life experiences of Pickton's victims for its fictional narrative. In 2016, controversy erupted over the publication of a purported autobiography titled Pickton, in His Own Words. The book's publication and marketing initiated critical petitions and government action to prevent Pickton from profiting from his crimes. The incident highlighted ongoing debates about whether convicted killers should be allowed to profit from their notoriety. After exhausting his appeals, Pickton was committed to federal prison, initially held at Kent Institution in British Columbia, before being transferred to Port Coquitlam Institution in Quebec in June 2018. In February 2024, having served the minimum required portion of his sentence, Pickton became eligible to apply for day parole, though no Parole Board of Canada hearing was scheduled. On May 19, 2024, Pickton's life came to a violent end when he was attacked by another prisoner at Port Coquitlam Institution. Martin Charest, described as having a history of assaulting other prisoners, speared Pickton in the head with a broken broom-like handle. Pickton was airlifted to a hospital and placed on life support, but died from complications of the attack on May 31, 2024. The death of Robert Pickton marked the end of one of Canada's most notorious criminal cases, but the impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through Canadian society. The case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, particularly when the victims come from marginalized communities. The Pickton farm property remains sealed under Crown lien, a monument to the crimes that occurred there. All buildings except a small barn have been demolished, leaving only an empty field where one of Canada's worst serial killers conducted his reign of terror. The cost of the investigation and prosecution exceeded $100 million, making it one of the most expensive criminal cases in Canadian history. Perhaps most importantly, the case forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. The systematic disappearance of women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside had been allowed to continue for years because the victims were viewed as disposable by a society that chose to look away from their suffering. The Pickton case became a catalyst for national awareness of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. While not all of Pickton's victims were Indigenous, a significant proportion were, highlighting the particular vulnerability of Indigenous women to violence and the inadequate response of authorities to their disappearances. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, established in 2016, traced its origins in part to the failures exposed by the Pickton case. The inquiry's final report called the pattern of violence against Indigenous women and girls a genocide, using language that would have been unthinkable in Canadian political discourse before the Pickton revelations. The law enforcement response to the Pickton case led to significant changes in how police handle missing persons investigations. New protocols were established for investigating cases involving vulnerable populations, and specialized units were created to focus on crimes against sex workers and Indigenous women. Community organizations in Vancouver's downtown Eastside developed new safety networks and support systems for women working in the sex trade. The buddy system and regular check-ins became standard practice, while advocacy groups fought for the decriminalization of sex work to reduce the vulnerability of those involved. The case also highlighted the importance of taking seriously reports from marginalized communities, even when those reports come from sources that authorities might traditionally view as unreliable. The dismissal of Wendy Lynn Eistetter's assault complaint due to her drug use became a cautionary tale about how bias can prevent justice. The story of Robert Pickton is ultimately a story about society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. For years, women disappeared from Vancouver's downtown East Side, while authorities and the public remained largely indifferent to their fate. It took the conviction of Canada's most prolific serial killer to force a reckoning with this indifference. The 26 women whose murders Pickton was charged with were not statistics or case numbers. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends whose lives had value regardless of the circumstances that made them vulnerable to a predator. Their deaths serve as a reminder that no one is disposable, and that society has a responsibility to protect all its members, not just those deemed worthy of attention. Today, memorials to Pickton's victims can be found throughout Vancouver's downtown East Side, serving as reminders of lives lost and lessons that must never be forgotten. The annual Women's Memorial March, held each February 14th, honors not only Pickton's victims but all missing and murdered women from the community. Robert William Pickton died in prison on May 31, 2024, after serving 17 years of his life sentence. He was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and confessed to 49 killings. This video is dedicated to the memory of all the women whose lives were lost to his violence, and to the ongoing fight for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across Canada. The investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women continues, with hundreds of cases still unsolved. The legacy of the Pickton case serves as both a warning about the consequences of societal indifference and a call to action to ensure that such systematic failures never occur again. In remembering the victims, we honor their lives and commit to protecting those who remain vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Behind the stench of manure and the smoke of carnival lights, Robert Pickton turned a pig farm into a slaughterhouse of silence. His victims, many Indigenous, many forgotten, weren't just failed by a killer. They were failed by a system that didn't see them, didn't hear them, and didn't act until it was too late. If this story unsettled you, opened your eyes, or reminded you of the value of every human life, please like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. We don't share these horrors to sensationalize them. We share them because memory matters, and justice begins with remembrance. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never forget, the worst monsters hide in plain sight, Behind barns, behind badges, behind the belief that some lives matter less than others.